And good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tweed Roosevelt, the chairman of the Theodore Roosevelt Institute at Long Island University, and I'm also a university professor. And today, I'm going to tell you something about the much neglected part of TR's presidency, at least of the public record. Uh, I think I've entitled this talk, TR Master Diplomat, and I think by the end, you'll agree that it's aptly titled. Now, a little outline. First, I will set the stage, and then I'll do a brief review of some of the many crises he faced. And then I'll go into some detail with a single crisis, the Venezuelan crisis of 1902-1903, which I believe best demonstrates TR's approach to a very difficult and dangerous situation. It's interesting because his international efforts have been largely ignored by historians and everybody. I've mentioned a little bit, but not much focuses on it. And this is odd, as he led an effort to bring America into the international arena and make us a major player. This really got us started on where we went to throughout the rest of the century. Now, TR was surprisingly a master diplomat. He was capable of extreme subtlety, and he had great negotiation skills. You might not think of that when you think of the character of it, but it was true. And the world at the time, which I will go into a little bit later, was on the brink of war during this whole period. And TR managed to hold back the tide. Now when he arrived at the presidency, he realized that the diplomatic service had been totally ignored, was very poor, was a backwater where political hacks had been appointed. We had not very good ambassadors. And he knew to start out, he had to build up the Foreign Service. They were underfunded. And so he began appointing really good people as ambassadors and in other roles, and Secretary of State too, of course, who was John Hay, and funding them. And during his presidency, he managed to turn the Foreign Service and the Consular Service into its position that it came, which was very professional, very capable. Now, a keystone of TR's whole foreign policy was based on the idea that he wanted to keep the peace, but he wanted to do it with honor. And he was very concerned about both aspects, and that was a difficult task. It's very interesting. He was extraordinarily successful at this. And it's hard to believe, but his administration, his 7.5 years administration, was the only administration in the 20th century during which no US soldier fired at anyone else, any foreign soldiers or anybody else, in any of the crises that came up on his watch. That was an extraordinary achievement, particularly given how volatile the world was at the time. Now, one of TR's basic beliefs was that the only way we would be listened to on the world stage, the only way anybody would pay any attention to us, was if we had a strong military. It didn't do us any good if we tried to bargain and tried to play roles if we didn't have the military might to back whatever stand we took. And in those days, a strong military meant a strong Navy. And through all of TR's adult life, he did what he could to build up the Navy. This started at Harvard when he was in college his last year. He started writing his first book, A Naval History of the War of 1812, which he published a few years later. And this continued when he was at appropriate places during his whole lifetime, particularly, of course, when he was Undersecretary of the Navy for McKinley, and then obviously as president. So I've gone into a lot before in my talk, TR in the Navy, about his naval relations. And if you missed that and want to see it, you can go to our website, roosevelt.liu.edu, and look at them. We're posting our speeches later. Now, TR's approach, now he had a large Navy, and he managed to do that. TR's approach wasn't just simply speak softly and carry a big stick. It was much more complex. And I'm hoping I can demonstrate to you that today. Now, during his presidency, there were some 20 or 30 problems, foreign relation problems, some large, some small. So I obviously can't go into all of them. So I'll only cover some of them today. There were maybe 4 or 5 major crises. But first, I want to tell you a little about some of the more minor ones, some big and some small. Now, the first thing I want to go into was the Philippine War. This was an offshoot of the Spanish-American War, which was fought in 1898. And one of the major sort of side battles, of course, there was Cuba, was in the Philippines. The Spaniards controlled the Philippines, and TR knew that would be a major theater of the war. And he had his favorite admiral. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy now. He had his favorite admiral, Dewey. So he maneuvered to get Dewey appointed as head of the fleet, and ordered him that as soon as hostilities started, he was to sail from Hong Kong, where he was. He should be ready to sail at any minute. He should sail to Manila Harbor and reduce the Spanish fleet. And indeed, he did that. And when he arrived in Manila, he confronted the Spanish fleet, and destroyed them. It was a fabulous battle, well loved by the Americans, of course. There was a little side effect which will come to play as we go forward here. The Kaiser in Germany was ruling Germany at the time. He felt that Germany was very far behind in the race for colonies, and he wanted new colonies. And he had his eye on the Far East, and he had his eye in the Americas, in the South Americas. And so he took TR. TR had said that we did not want the Philippines to become an American colony, and he thought that was an opportunity that when we left, he could take over. So he sent some naval vessels to Manila Harbor during this battle, and there was a showdown between Dewey and the Germans. And Dewey, without firing a shot, but negotiations and firmness, managed to chase out the Germans, and they chase away the German ships. And this, of course, the Germans knew this. This was kind of a loss of honor on their face, so they remembered it well. Well, when the naval battle was over, Dewey was sort of finished, but there was the whole issue of the land problem in the Philippines, and the war continued on. And most of it was fought against a group of Muslims in the South called the Moros. This was a vicious battle. I like this magazine illustration, I guess it was. This was a vicious battle, and lots of atrocities on both sides, and it dragged on and on. It was a guerrilla warfare. The Americans were getting tired of it, and when TR became president, it was still going on, and he was determined to end it. And indeed, he succeeded in doing that. Now, he had no interest in Philippines as a colony. He wanted to turn it into a democracy for the United States, for the Far East. And he didn't succeed in getting that done on his watch, but it did indeed happen years later. So this was an irritant inside, and these were the only soldiers who, during TR's tenure, got into any kind of foreign fight. So now I want to go on to another crisis, which seems like kind of an odd one to start with, and this had to do with the Japanese and the West Coast. What was happening? Here's a photograph of a bunch of very determined Japanese ladies. I love this photograph. And look at the women all dressed up in the nines. I wouldn't want to take any of them on. And in any case, here they are in San Francisco, getting off their ship that has brought them to the United States and going to Angel Island, which was sort of the Ellis Island equivalent on the West Coast. Now, the problem wasn't with the Japanese women. The problem was with Japanese men. And there were a huge immigration of Japanese into the United States then. And this caused all kinds of the Americans, the white Americans, were of great concern. There were no controls on immigration then, so just as many could get on ships and pay their way came, and they flooded California, and it turned into a very, very ugly situation. It was much like Jim Crow. I mean, there were race riots, there were lynchings, there were rapes, there were all kinds of atrocities. And perhaps the major aspect of this was the reaction of particularly San Francisco, of the mayor and the people of demanding segregated schools where the Japanese school kids would not be taught with, quote, American school kids, and they would be segregated. Things were getting pretty out of line, and you could see how vicious the attitudes were. Look at this poster placed all around. Asians must not be naturalized. No Japs in our school. Mass meeting. Mayor Schmids, as you see there, is going to save us all from the yellow peril, and on and on. Now, Japan was very strong at the time, unlike China, the weak man of the Far East. Japan was strong and could insist that its citizens be treated properly. And TR knew this, and TR knew that someday, he believed that someday there would be a confrontation in the Far East between the United States and Japan, but he was determined not to let it happen on his watch. And the Japanese had a very powerful navy. I think they were fourth in tonnage at the time. We had started out being ninth behind Chile, and now we'd sort of come up to be a player there. But still, it was a difficult situation. And the second problem was that he had no control over the school situation in California, and really there was nothing he could do about the sort of Californian internal politics on all this. But the Japanese didn't understand that. They thought since he was the president, he could do anything he wanted. So he had to sort of negotiate both with the Californians and with the Japanese. Eventually, he was successful. And of course, there was no immigration policy, that, no mechanism for preventing in a legal way the Japanese immigration. But he eventually, through all kinds of negotiations, much of them back channel, managed to forge something called the Gentleman's Agreement, which basically the Japanese backed down, and they said they would keep the Japanese, because they could control immigration, keep the Japanese from immigrating in the United States. In exchange, the Californians would come to their senses, and that's how this whole was resolved. War, therefore, was averted. TR at the time had said, quite thinking of the future, that we need to be careful of Japan, and we need particularly to be wary of their possibility that they would someday attack Hawaii. Well, another major issue at the time, this was a really different kind of issue. TR was building up the Navy, and he managed to get Congress to build a whole bunch of new capital ships. And so now we had a powerful Navy, but the world didn't know about it, and he wanted to show the world. So he decided on what he called the Great White Fleet. He painted all the ships white, and he sent them on a round-the-world cruise. It was called a peace cruise, but actually it was meant to show the world that we now were a player, and they had to listen to us. It was an extraordinary cruise. You can see there where it left the United States and went down around South America and all the way through Asia and the Mediterranean and so on. And it succeeded in what it was doing. The world sort of got up on its hind legs and took notice and realized that the Americans really now did have the power to be a player. Now, during TR's time, I seem a little funny, but during TR's time, there were a lot of tensions between the United States and Great Britain. TR had believed in a special relationship with Great Britain, but there were some things that had to be dealt with. And one of these was called the Alaskan boundary crisis. And this had been going on for a long time, way back to the Russians. When the Russians controlled Alaska, they had a treaty in 1825 that sort of delineated, but unclearly, the boundaries. And we sort of inherited this when we acquired Alaska in 1867, when we purchased Seward's Folly, so to speak. And it wasn't resolved. Now, at the time, Canada was an independent country, but sort of. But Britain controlled its foreign relations. So the concern over this border would be really a confrontation between Britain and the United States. Well, nobody would have cared particularly. You can see the various lines there, green, blue, those different, red. They were the different sort of lines of where the border might go. It became a problem with the Klondike gold rush. And the Klondike gold was there, and this became a major sort of port of bringing the gold in and out, and whoever controlled it was very, very important. Well, the situation, therefore, began to degenerate, and it got to the point where armed soldiers were facing each other, British or Canadian soldiers and American soldiers, and again, it looked like it could blow out of proportion. But TR, with, again, back channel and various friendships he'd established over the years, he'd been to England a few times, managed to diffuse the whole thing. Another confrontation with the Brits involved the cod fishing, George's Banks up off Newfoundland and the east coast of the United States. This had been an area of contentious since the first Europeans came to the US. It wasn't inside the territorial waters at the time, which was 3 miles. And all kinds of confrontations, particularly in the time of TR, between the Canadian Newfoundlanders and the American fishermen. So this threatened to be a major problem, and TR managed to thread this again through diplomacy and negotiations and sort of give and take. And finally, oddly enough, there was a Olympics game crisis. Now, 1908 was the first real Olympic Games. It's where the Olympics really sort of established itself. And it was held in England, and this is where the Irish question got all involved in this. And the English were trying to figure out how to deal with the Irish athletes and who they represented, and everybody felt aggrieved, and there was a lot of screaming and yelling. And the Americans got involved in this whole controversy too, because the Irish American citizens of Irish ancestry very much favored the Irish and supported them in many ways over the time. And the whole thing looked like it was going to blow up. Well, it all got more or less solved, but it was a major issue at the time. Now, another touchy international situation involved Russia and the pogroms with the Jews. There had been a major pogrom, as they were called, in Kishinev in Russia, which at the time got tremendous amount of focus from the news medias and other people. It was actually a fairly small event, as these things go. I don't want to, do anything to denigrate them, but it only lasted 3 days. 49 Jews were killed, 600 raped by the Cossacks. They were famous, I believe, rapes. And it was a very serious international incident. And Jews in America were appealing to Roosevelt. This was Zionism was quite strong, building up then. The Jews appealed to Roosevelt to try and do something. It wasn't anything particularly to do, but he did, and was willing to sort of beard the Kaiser, the Tsar, and jawbone him at least, and everything sort of settled down. But this particular incident remained the archetype of anti-Semitism, and raised, through the years, and remained that until, of course, the Holocaust came. The next crisis was really an opera buffo crisis. It involved the Moroccans, and it never threatened. It was never going to grow into a world war, but there was a lot of noise and fire and flame about it. There was a guy named Razuli, who was a warlord in Morocco, and he captured an American named Petakaris and held him for ransom, huge ransom, and much concessions he wanted from various people. And TR would not, as still is the policy of the United States, not negotiate with terrorists or kidnappers for obvious reasons. And so this thing festered on for a while. But it so happened that it was reaching its sort of pinnacle during TR's run for his second term as president in 1904. And actually, at the convention, TR used this incident to his advantage. And he announced from the podium at the convention that he had sent a telegram to Petikaris, the warlord who Raisuli, the warlord who held Petikaris. And he said, "I've sent a telegram to Raisuli, and the telegram says, Petikaris alive or Raisuli dead." Well, you can imagine what happened at the convention. People rose in their seats and roared and yelled and clapped. What could be more Rooseveltian than that? Well, the whole thing did blow over. It turned out to be something of a farce, as I say. There was a movie made about it called The Wind and the Lion, you might remember. It wasn't very accurate, but it's sort of fun. All right, another problem, another incident, international opportunity, let's put it that way, was the Boxer Rebellion. Now, this did not happen under TR's watch. This was earlier. The Boxers in China were kind of a peasant group of rebels who clothed themselves. It was quite interesting. They called themselves Christians, and they had a very odd form of Christianity. And their leader claimed he was Jesus's brother. Odd, if you imagine that. But in any case, it was basically an anti-foreigner rebellion. And here you see a very lurid picture of, heads on stakes. And there in the front, you can see a Chinese with a downed European. He looks like he's pulling his teeth, and there's a dead nun in the front right. They've murdered her and maybe done much worse. And you can see a monk about, wouldn't sell him life insurance, a monk back there, and somebody sort of on a cross. It was a vicious, and very powerful rebellion. The leader of China, who was the Empress Dowager Shishu at the time, she encouraged them because she wanted, they were against the foreigners, and she really wanted the foreigners out of China. Well, when these rebels started to threaten various European or Western enclaves in China, like Shanghai and Beijing and the like, the Western nations felt they had to do something. And so they put together a consortium, a military group, to go in and clean this up. And it involved a bunch of British, European soldiers from Germany, Britain, Italy, and the like, some Japanese. And they went in and they succeeded. They succeeded in putting this down. And as a result of that, they demanded huge indemnities from China for the supposed damage that was done. Well, this is, again, it's all before TR's time. The indemnities were paid to foreign nations, and they gladly spelled it. Well, under TR's watch, the Chinese sent we're getting ready to pay the United States the indemnities. And so John Hay, the Secretary of State and TR, they felt that this was a huge amount of money, and they felt it was really way beyond what was appropriate. And so they agreed to send back the excess to China, but they said to China, "We'll do this, but you need to use it for education." So the Chinese accepted this, and the money did indeed go back for education in China. And they did two things with it. One is they built the great Chinese university in Beijing, Qingzhou, which is considered the Harvard of Asia, and pretty much everybody agrees is the best university in all the Far East. And second, they set up a scholarship program to send Chinese students to the United States. And they started doing that. And over the years, thousands and thousands of Chinese have come to the United States and studied. And in fact, it is still going on today. We are still having Chinese called the Boxer scholarships, I think, and they're still funding it now. Also during TR's time, different kind of foreign relations issue was the issue of humanitarianism. And TR felt that this was really an obligation, almost a moral obligation of the United States. And he did what he could when foreign areas were struck by natural disasters. Here, one of the major ones was in Messina in Italy, in Sicily. And it just happened that it destroyed the city, killing thousands of people. It was really a terrible thing. And of course, reported all around the world. One of It just so happened that the Great White Fleet was more or less in the area, so TR dispatched some relief ships to help out. And he did this all around the world. There were earthquakes in China and places in the Caribbean and so on and other things. And as I say, he felt it was a moral duty, but of course it was also a very good public relations move. Now you will remember Clara Barton, who in the Civil War created the American Red Cross. Well, it was during this period under TR that the Red Cross became a major force for humanitarian aid around the world, which it is, of course, still today. So now let's look at some of TR's major crises, 3 or 4 major crises. There's TR as president. Look how young he is. He really is quite astonishing. He still remains the youngest president ever elected to office. Kennedy was the youngest president, but not when he went into the office. Anyway, so Kennedy was the youngest elected president. TR was, of course, accidental. Anyway, at first I need to tell you how dangerous the world was then. The world was really divided into 2 camps, 2 military camps, tightly woven together by intertangling treaties of all kinds. And these were big countries and small countries. Germany really was on one side, and Britain and Russia and France on the other. And they were quite evenly balanced in terms of military power. But it was a very dangerous time. Everybody knew then we were on the brink of war. At any time it could break out. And even the smallest of disputes, because of the intertwining treaties, could blow up into a war. And so TR, who was determined to keep world peace if he could, had to face a number of crises where this might have happened. And one of them was the Russo-Japanese War. And what happened here, there's a map, as you can see, I think you can see my cursor. It was really fought over Manchuria. Manchuria was a very resources-rich place, and both Japan and Russia wanted it. Russia had built the Trans-Siberian Railroad that went through Manchuria, and so that was another reason Russia was concerned about it. And they got into a hot war over this. Troops fighting viciously in Manchuria, and more or less to a stalemate. So it looked like it was going to boil down to a naval battle, basically. And of course, the Japanese had the advantage. They were very close here. And the Germans had a few ships here, but their main fleet was way over in the Baltic. And so they had to send their ships a tremendous long way around before they could engage in this battle. It took them a long time, but more importantly, it stretched their resources and it stretched the quality of the crew. You know, they were not exactly rested. Eventually, they all managed to confront each other in the Tsushima Straits, which are right here between Japan and Korea. And that's where the great naval battle was fought. And it was a total victory on the part of the Japanese. They destroyed the Russians. This was a huge surprise to the rest of the world, who said, oh, you know, they never thought much the Asians could do much. And here they'd beaten one of the great navies of the world. And so it looked like this might keep on going, and it looked like each side might appeal to their entangling treaties that they had. Japan with the English and the French, and Russia with the Germans. Anyway, it looked like it was going to be a really serious problem. So TR wanted to try to do what he could to stop it. Now, the Russians at this point were looking the weaker because they had lost the naval battle. But the problem that Japan had is it was running out of money. It didn't have money to continue fighting the war. So they were in a very precarious position. But neither side wanted to be seen as the first one to sue for peace. And TR understood that and saw how dangerous that could be. And so he maneuvered himself into a position where he basically was seen as asking them to join a peace conference that he would host in the United States. And this was acceptable to both sides because it didn't look like they were the weaker ones. So they agreed to send their delegates to the United States. And here they are, the delegates, very high-level people, of course, the Russians on the left and the Japanese on the right. And these were going to be extremely delicate negotiations. And it's an interesting thing here. It was TR decided the first meeting would be he would host them on his yacht, the Mayflower, which he was at the time up at Sagamore Hill, his home on Long Island. This was Long Island Sound. So he brought the two opposing parties to the Mayflower. And now this gives you an indication of how important the niceties of protocol are. Each side thought that TR favored the other side. And they were very sharp-eyed, looking for any sign that TR favored one side or the other. And so at this meeting on the Mayflower, it was fraught with minefields. Let me give you two examples. One of them was the first meeting was in the wardroom, sort of as a cocktail party before a luncheon, and was in this wardroom. And the question that was sort of the protocol questions when TR took them into the dining room, who would be, sort of the one he would usher in. So what TR did is he arranged with with the crew that they sort of quietly opened the doors to the dining room. And then TR, in typical TR fashion, talking a mile a minute aloud and distracting everybody, kept them so distracted that he ushered them in to the dining room and nobody noticed who went first or who went where. And the second issue was where they would sit. Now, there's only one seat to the right of the president, and that would be the main seat. So the question was, would the Russians sit there, or what would happen? So TR solved this problem. Here's the dining room. TR solved this problem by having a buffet, and nobody sat anywhere. So let's just give you an idea of the subtleties of this and the ability of TR to sort of navigate this. Well, the end result, they went to Portsmouth, they negotiated. It was a very difficult, long negotiation, but the end result was TR established peace. And here's a nice cartoon of the two sides, rather reluctant Kaiser and the emperor, but he did it. And for that, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. It's the only person in history to have both the Nobel Prize and the Medal of Honor. And it all worked out very well. TR, I love this cover. TR, having received the Nobel Peace Prize, and the cover, I don't know if you can see it in the bottom, it says, "Peace abroad and the big stick at home," which I think is really a very interesting and enlightening view about TR, because there's a lot of truth to that. All right, another crisis was something called the Algeciras crisis, which I won't go into detail, don't have time, but this basically involved France, England, and the Kaiser. And here you see the Kaiser is leering, trying to seduce the French. What he was trying to do was break up the relationship between the French and the British over something that was happening in Morocco, who controlled Morocco. And TR saw this as a very dangerous situation. And so he engineered a peace conference or a way of settling the dispute in Algeciras, Spain. And that worked out well. Now, a different kind of foreign relations was TR in the Panama Canal. And here he had a totally different persona. Here he really did fit the bullying, big stick overseas kind of guy. And he really sort of totally bullied Colombia into getting this. He was determined, A, to build the Panama Canal, which of course was great for trade, but also allowed him to have his navy from either coast get to the other side quickly. And he was determined that the Americans would control it. And so he's been, I think, sort of rightly accused of going overboard on this. But in the end result, he got the canal. If you want to learn more about this fascinating book by David McCullough, who's a wonderful writer, wrote a book called Path Between the Seas. I highly recommend it. You'll love it. Well, unfortunately, we don't have time to go into in depth of any of these. So let me get on to the Venezuelan crisis as promised. This was in 1902 and 1903. This is a new, I've never seen this before. Somebody sent this to me. I think you did read it. Thank you very much. An etching of TR, quite a good one, I think. So let me set the stage a little bit here and get us going. So first of all, this involves the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was of course, Monroe was the president who articulated it, and he did so in a very sort of offhanded way. It was just a message to Congress. But basically what the Monroe Doctrine said is that European and other powers who had any land in the Americas could keep the land they had, but they couldn't acquire new land and they couldn't trade their land to anyone else. And so that was our insistence. We saw it as a national security issue. Well, between Monroe's time up until TR's time, there was fortunately nobody really challenged this because we didn't have the military might to enforce it. So nothing really happened until TR's time. And what happened in TR's time, the major threat was the Kaiser in Germany. TR was suspicious and actually knew that the Kaiser wanted to build the canal. And if he didn't get that, he at least wanted it internationalized and controlled internationally. And TR would have no part of that. And also TR suspected, I think with good reason, that the Kaiser, as I've said earlier, wanted colonies and he'd love to have one in South America. So here's what happened. There were debt issues. Many South American countries, including Venezuela, were willing to borrow large amounts of money from European sources, either governments or private individuals, and then spend money like drunken sailors. And they did. And then, but of course, you have to pay it back at some point. And they couldn't. And in fact, they were even having trouble paying the interest back. So they would borrow more and more money at higher and higher interest rates. The Europeans were willing to continue to lend the money at very high, unfair, usurious interest rates. And then finally, when the piper came home to being paid, they couldn't pay it and they defaulted. And so this is what happened in Venezuela. The Venezuela leader was a guy named Cipriano Castro. Isn't it interesting that so many of our problems with South American and Caribbean dictators are with guys named Castro? But anyway, there he is, and looking rather respectable. Actually, he was quite respectable and relatively honest, but he found himself in this terrible debt crisis. And so, he got to the point where the Venezuelans owed Germany, for example, $500 million. And the other major debt holders were the Italians and the English. And so when those three countries finally got exasperated, they decided they would mount a blockade of Venezuela and to demand repayment. So TR was very concerned about this because he was suspicious, of course, of the Kaiser's territorial demands and the Panama Canal. So TR was presented with a situation where he wanted to preserve the integrity of the Monroe Doctrine, and he wanted to keep the Europeans from getting any territory in the Americas, but and of course he wanted to keep the Panama Canal under American control, but he didn't want to get into war. He wanted to do all this without starting a war. Now TR was confident that he could reach an agreement with the British. I think I have some cartoons here with the British, but the Germans and the Germans were sort of the major problem. This is a lovely cartoon. And there you see John Bull, the Brit, and the Kaiser plucking the Venezuelan duck, I think it is, with Uncle Sam looking on. So TR was determined to take control of the situation, try to calm it down, and figure out a way out of it. Now, he knew he could handle the British. It was the Germans and the Italians didn't matter in this thing. So the principal threat was the Kaiser. And what he needed to do was to get the Kaiser to back down and accept arbitration to deal with this, not get into war and not take out, not take any territory. But the Kaiser was notoriously difficult to deal with. who's a very strong personality. He terrified all around him, and he had a huge ego. And, you know, he was just not easy to deal with. I'm using a metaphor that I think TR would have liked. I mean, he was like a rattlesnake, and one false move on your part, he could strike. So TR had to deal with him. Now, TR realized that one of the major problems he had was to convince the Kaiser that whatever threats TR's made, that he was willing to carry them out, that he was not bluffing. Now, Europeans and the Kaiser knew that Americans were poker players. I love this thing. It's come out fairly recently of all the presidents playing poker. And they all knew that a major component of poker was bluffing. So they all thought that Americans were at heart bluffers and bravados and would, you know, do all sorts of things, but it was just a bluff. Now, TR was not a poker player in spite of this image. I have found no reference to TR to poker anywhere, or that he ever even played poker. And he wasn't a bluffing. The only term I know, his campaign slogan was a square deal for all Americans. And that was a card referring to cards, but that's the only one I know. And so TR's problem was how to convince the Germans that, that he wasn't bluffing. Now, you got to remember that the Second World War started when the Allies were unable to convince Germany that they would actually go to war if Germany went into Poland. And the tragic result of that is evident to everybody. So anyway, how it played out. So there were the German ships and the reluctant British. And the Germans started off by firing on various forts and sinking the minuscule Venezuelan fleet. And the Venezuelan response, oh, I forgot him. I think he's he's the German admiral. I think he just looks wonderful. Look at those mustaches. Hercule Poirot would be delighted with them. Anyway, the Venezuelans responded by firing back, but they had no modern weapons. They were ineffectual. They couldn't make much progress from the military point of view. So what they did is they arrested all the British and German citizens they could find and confiscated their territories. And of course, this only heated up the whole thing. Well, now let's think about TR's response. It was very well planned and measured, but firm. And he was determined to maintain the peace. So first of all, there was already planned major naval exercises in Puerto Rico. So he had his ships there already. So now we have to look at how he responded to this both privately and publicly. And you got to really look at the difference, what he did privately, what he did publicly. Publicly, he sent various sort of messages to the Kaiser, but he didn't scream and yell and get press and everybody carrying on about how vicious Saul was and what was going to happen. But he did various things. For example, he put Admiral Dewey, there's TR, he put Admiral Dewey in charge of the fleet. You remember Dewey was the one that chased the Germans out of the Philippines, and he was known to hate the Germans. He also gave, every admiral needs a flagship, usually a battleship or something. TR gave Dewey's gave the Mayflower his yacht, presidential yacht, to Dewey. So Dewey would be going into war in the presidential yacht. And that would certainly send a message. He was also did sort of some subtle things. He gave maps and charts to the newspaper reporters. He had the Navy recall sailors, 6 sailors to the ships. And anybody who knew anything about Navy said he didn't do that unless the situation was really bad. So that's what he did in kind of publicly. Privately, he had both official and unofficial conduits to the Kaiser, the main one being the German ambassador. Not a very strong man, as you might gather from that picture, Ambassador von Hohenberg, Ben. TR called him into his office, and he made very clear what he wanted. He wanted the Germans to accept arbitration to solve this problem and to stand down. And he pointed out to the German ambassador to point out to the Kaiser that this was a terrible place to fight a naval battle. Here you are. You can see Venezuela is here. Here's Puerto Rico, where our fleet was. It's completely protected and surrounded by these, Caribbean islands. And And the supply lines for the German fleet would be long, and they only had a few ships here. So even though the German army was larger, German Navy was larger than the Americans, here in this theater, we outnumbered them 5-1. And so this was not a place to take a stand. And so then TR explained this all to the ambassador and then said, oh, geez, sorry, getting out of control here. And then said that they had 10 days, that the Kaiser had 10 days in which to agree to a negotiated peace, arbitration, or else TR would send the fleet. So the ambassador left, and he was, let's see, there's the Kaiser. I love the Kaiser's helmet, don't you? Isn't that terrific? Well, the German ambassador left. He was terrified of the Kaiser, didn't want to bring this message to him. In fact, didn't. Maybe he thought TR was bluffing. I don't know. So nothing happened for several days. And then I think it was the 8th day, the ambassador asked for audience with TR, came into the White House. They chatted about the weather and birds and whatever they chatted. He started to leave and said nothing about this. And TR said, well, wait a minute. What's the Kaiser's answer? And the ambassador said, well, he said, no, he won't negotiate. So TR said, well, there's no point wasting time then. And he moved the deadline up 1 day, which basically gave the ambassador 1 day to get an answer. Well, this finally emboldened him. And he reported what was to be reported to the German Kaiser. Now remember, this is all done secretly and behind line. There was no sort of paper trail of any sort. And in the end, the Kaiser was presented with 2 choices. He could go to war in a very weak position to do anything about it, or he could accept arbitration. But most importantly, he could he could be the one that proposed arbitration, and he could be the one who would get all the credit for it, because TR had set it up so that it didn't say that anywhere else. And so the Kaiser came to his senses and did it, and that's how the whole thing came to an end. And when the group of the arbitrators did a very fair arbitration between the debt holders and the Venezuelans, didn't pay the worst of them. So out of this, out of this came the Theodore Roosevelt, or rather the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said we would be the police force to make sure that the governments in South America and the Caribbean would behave as responsibly, particularly in terms of debt. And that's, there's both sides of this. It's caused a lot of problem over the years. So the aftermath of this was that Roosevelt managed to keep this all secret. He did mention it in his biography, but most of the historians said, he's just being a braggadocio, he's bragging, didn't happen. But then along came a Navy officer, Jerry Hendricks, who was a Harvard PhD actually, and had been a line officer, really went into it. He could find no official documents. There were no official documents, but he put together all kinds of sort of internal orders that in a circumstantial case proved that TR had indeed done this. And he was backed up later by Edmund Morris in his great book. It's interesting to think of the similarities and differences between this Venezuelan crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis of Kennedy and Khrushchev. And sometime later, when we think of some of these things. So I have some conclusions here. TR, first of all, he believed in what he called practical idealism. In other words, he wanted to do the possible. He didn't want to make Pyrrhic stands on moral issues that he couldn't, make come to fruition. So they might be stretch targets, but he wanted to do it. He wanted to get involved in things that could be done. So that was one of his issues. Another in approaching a crisis like this, not only the international ones, but clearly here, was he believed that his role as president required him to know in detail what was going on, to keep really above the situation, and to understand every aspect of it and apply his vast knowledge to this. And then he believed in planning very carefully and in detail, both privately, with private people and with the government. And he believed in giving it his close personal attention, pay attention to what was going on, to understand everything, again, to know every detail. And he thought outside of the box. So for example, in this case, He didn't really do the normal diplomatic approach. You know, transparency is a big issue these days. And a lot of people talk about transparency, and it's generally believed that everything should be transparent. Well, here's an example of a situation where transparency would have resulted in war, almost certainly. So anyway, he believed in several basic principles as well. He believed A, in a strong military, so people would listen to you. B, be fair and just, which he did. It turned out that was the result in the Venezuelan crisis, also in the indemnities to China, another example. And then don't bluff. Don't bluff. Carry out your threat. If you have to, carry out your threats. Don't bluff. You can't have a reputation for bluffing. And finally, he believed in allowing your adversaries a way out, a way to save face. And these are all examples here. And an overall belief that, at least on his watch, he wanted to maintain the balance of power in the world. And he pretty much did that. The status quo remained during his watch. So that's what I have to say about TR as master diplomat. I hope you found it informative, and I hope you will agree with me that TR was, his character was a lot broader. He had a lot more things in his kit bag than just screaming and yelling at people and shaking his fist in bully pulpit. So having done that, I now want to turn it over to you, Rita, to give me whatever questions you have. So go ahead. Let me hear you.
Sure.
Let me see if I can also get out of this full screen, which I think I can do here. Go ahead.
Okay. So thank you everyone for joining us today. If you have questions, you can put them into the Q&A box, but we did receive a number during the presentation. One of the questions we have for you, Professor Roosevelt, is did TR ever meet the Kaiser face to face?
That's an interesting thing. And by the way, I won't be able to get to all the questions. I'll try to post them online in a few days at roosevelt.liu.edu. He had never met the Kaiser before this incident. He'd traveled to Europe twice or three times actually as a young man, and but he had never met the Kaiser, I believe. But he did afterwards. And the Kaisers kind of learned from this. The Kaiser was afraid of TR, I think, or at least highly respected him. And they had a rather distance. After TR went to Africa, he then traveled through Europe and met the Kaiser. And the Kaiser allowed him, had to set up, was the first foreigner, I guess, ever to review the German army. And the Kaiser would tweak TR occasionally with things. He sent a very detailed analysis that only his spies would have known in a picture form. I wish I had an image of it here, of the Great White Fleet. The interesting thing about this is that I believe, and other people can disagree with this, that I believe if TR had won the presidency before the First World War started, that might have stopped, he might have stopped it. And the Kaiser might have thought twice. He didn't have much respect for Wilson, and he might have thought twice before starting the war. So that was their interchange. It was always at a distance and somewhat, they were leery of each other. Next question.
We have a question here from Hillary asking if there are any books that you would recommend on Theodore Roosevelt's diplomacy.
Well, there's several of them. Unfortunately, I don't have them in front of me, so I can't read them off. There are 5 or 6 books on the subject, starting quite a way back. I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll make a list of them and post them on the website. There are 4 or 5 of them that are really worth reading. I mentioned the Hendricks one specifically about the Navy, but Velvet and Iron is one. I'll give you a list later on.
Okay, so that would be those answers would be on our website at liu.edu/Roosevelt, the list of the books. Okay, one of the questions I have here is, did TR ever travel overseas?
That's an interesting question. Yes, he did. TR was raised with a silver spoon or a gold spoon, whatever the expression is, in his mouth. So his father took the family overseas twice on grand tours of Europe, Middle East, and Egypt when they were young. And TR, they all saw much of Europe. And actually, TR and his brothers and sisters spent several months living with a German family, learning German and being tutored. It was, and these Germans were tough on them, but he learned a lot about Germany. When TR got married, he had spent his honeymoon, his second marriage. He spent his honeymoon in Europe, met some of his mother's Confederate cousins in England, climbed the Matterhorn and all that. So he made several trips before the presidency. At TR's time, no president had ever left the country during his presidency. So TR was the first. And TR went down to Panama to observe how the Panama Canal was progressing. And it really is, you see him, it's almost boyish. He gets into a huge steam shovel that was one of the devices, enormous thing to build the canal, and played around with it. But that's the only time he left as president. After his presidency, he went to Africa for a tour, and I may have a talk on that in the future. And it wound up with a tour around Europe. And TR recorded these in a wonderful series of letters that are available. I'll talk about them next time a little bit in my next talk, which will be about TR and writing. So I'll save that for later on.
Where is the presidential yacht, the Mayflower, today?
I think it's long gone to its final resting place, I believe. I don't think it's survived. But it's a good question. I'll do a little research into that and put that. I have to be careful here because there's always somebody in the audience who knows more than I do about any particular aspect of this, and I'll no doubt be taken to task at our website. By the way, I'm thinking of creating a chat room on the website so that we can continue these discussions later on. I'll look into it. I think it was scrapped at some point, and I don't know in front of me. Wow, you're asking me all kinds of questions I don't know the answers to. That's great. I love it. Next question, Rita.
I have the final question because we'll have to wrap up here, but it's from Louisa. How did President Roosevelt obtain his intelligence about various world crises? Did it go beyond diplomats into the spy arena?
Yes, it went to all kinds of arenas. Less spy. We weren't very good at spying in those days. It was more through personal connections. So he developed friendships from people all around the world, private people, government people, diplomats, and so on. And he maintained a very lively letter writing effort, and then saw them when they were in the United States. And he befriended foreign ambassadors in a personal way. And I'll have some things to say about that in some of my other lectures. But it was sort of a network of informal, as well as, of course, all the formal stuff that came from the State Department. And furthermore, he was very well read. And he knew the histories of many countries in details, and the backgrounds. And as I said, he visited some of them. So he used everything he could to understand what was going on. And I think that served him very well. Now, I guess that's the last question. Let me make it some closing remarks here. I hope you've enjoyed this series of 4 free talks that I have offered you over the last several months. And I have many more planned starting next month, when I hope with one which I hope you'll really find very interesting and informative. I've called it TR Literary Fella. That was a term he used, and it's about TR's writings and readings and everything related to that. Now, there are a lot of stories here, and most people think of TR as a politician, but in fact, he earned his money. He wasn't rich at this point. He came from a rich family, but the money had not come all to him. So he earned his living writing. He earned it from his pen. And he was really prolific. First of all, he wrote more than 40 books, which I think is more than any other president. He wrote hundreds of book introductions, thousands of editorials and articles, and over 150,000 letters. So all this provides a window into TR's mind and character. And it's an enormous corpus of work, which of course I can only cover briefly, starting very young, when he started keeping a diary when he was, I don't know, 5 or 6 or something. So following that, I have several other talks planned. One will be on TR and leadership and his leadership specifically. One will be on TR and the environment. And then the last of the next series of 4, which I think will be really fun, is TR on TR's family, the nuclear family and the extended family. And that's a huge group of really very interesting people. So the first talk, TR Literary Fellow, will be on Tuesday, November 17th at noon Eastern. And I look forward to seeing you all then. Registration will be available in a few days at roosevelt.liu.edu. Until then, goodbye, stay healthy, and vote. Everybody vote. Thank you very much, and goodbye.